It began on a night when the sky forgot how to be silent. Jacob Miller, a cattle rancher in the plains of Montana, had spent 43 years watching the stars from his porch, but never once had they looked back at him until that October evening when the wind died and the universe held its breath. He was a man of routines, of morning coffee before sunrise, of fixing fences and feeding livestock, of Sunday sermons in a white church where the hymns echoed off wooden walls. His hands were calloused, his faith was simple, and his expectations were few. But that night something ancient stirred in the silence between heartbeats, and Jacob Miller would learn that the boundaries between heaven and earth were thinner than the pages of the Bible he kept on his nightstand. Some truths arrive not in scripture, but in starlight, not in sermons but in silence, and what Jacob was about to discover would shake the foundations of everything he thought he knew about angels, demons, and the hierarchy of light itself. The evening had been ordinary until it wasn't. Jacob stood on his front porch, a mug of black coffee cooling in his weathered hands, watching the cattle settle in the western pasture. The sun had dropped below the horizon an hour ago, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, and now the darkness was spreading like spilled ink across the Montana plains. He'd been thinking about his daughter Sarah, about how she'd stopped coming to church after college, how she'd called his faith quaint and outdated, how the distance between them had grown wider than the miles separating her apartment in Seattle from his ranch. He'd been praying for her, asking God for a sign, for something to bridge the gap between doubt and belief. Be careful what you pray for, the old saying goes, because sometimes the answer comes in ways that shatter everything you thought you understood. Jacob set his mug down on the railing and noticed something peculiar. The crickets had stopped singing. The night birds had gone silent. Even the cattle in the distance stood frozen, their heads raised toward the sky as if listening to a frequency beyond human hearing. That's when he saw it. A light in the northern sky, not moving like a plane or blinking like a satellite, but hovering, pulsing with a rhythm that reminded him of breathing, of something alive and aware. At first, Jacob told himself it was a drone, maybe someone from the neighboring ranch playing with new technology, but the light was too bright, too steady, and it was growing larger, descending slowly toward his property with the patience of something that had traveled impossible distances and had all the time in the world. His heart began to pound against his ribs, and he felt a strange mixture of fear and curiosity, the same feeling he'd had as a boy when he'd wandered too far into the woods and realized he was lost. He should have gone inside, called the sheriff, grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace, but his feet remained planted on the wooden porch, and his eyes stayed locked on that descending light. It was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache, like the first time he'd held his newborn daughter, like the last time he'd kissed his wife before cancer took her 3 years ago. Some beauty carries weight, carries meaning, carries the unmistakable signature of something greater than the sum of its parts. Jacob had heard about CE5, about the protocols some people use to supposedly contact extraterrestrial intelligence, about meditation and intention and calling out to the cosmos with an open heart. He dismissed it as New Age nonsense, as a distraction from real faith, but in his loneliness after Mary died, he'd started reading things online, watching videos late at night when the silence of the house became too heavy to bear. He'd even tried it once, sitting in his pasture under the stars, feeling foolish, asking the universe if anyone was out there, if God had other children scattered across creation, if the angels in the Bible might have been something else entirely. That had been 3 weeks ago, and he'd felt nothing except the cold seeping through his jacket and the embarrassment of a grown man talking to empty sky. But tonight, as that light descended toward his ranch, Jacob wondered if his prayer had been heard after all, if the delay was simply the time it took for something to travel from wherever it dwelled in the vast dark between stars. The light touched down in the middle of his northern pasture, about 200 yards from where he stood frozen on the porch. It didn't crash or thunder or shake the earth. It simply settled, gentle as a feather, and then the brilliance began to dim, revealing a shape beneath, a form that seemed to be made of light itself, tall and humanoid, but not quite human, proportions slightly wrong in ways his brain struggled to process. Jacob's breath came in short gasps, and his mind raced through every explanation. Hallucination, dream, stroke, divine vision, demonic deception. But the cold night air on his skin felt real. The splinters in the porch railing pressed into his palms, and when he blinked, the figure remained, standing motionless in his pasture, like it was waiting for permission to approach. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had become elastic and strange, and finally Jacob found his voice, rough and cracking from disuse and shock. He didn't shout, didn't demand identification, just whispered into the darkness what his heart needed to know. "Are you an angel?" The figure didn't respond with words, but Jacob felt something shift in the air, felt a presence brush against his mind like fingers through water, and suddenly he knew with absolute certainty that whatever stood in his pasture was aware of him, was studying him, was deciding something important. Then the figure began to move, not walking, not floating, but flowing across the pasture with a grace that defied physics, closing the distance between them in seconds that felt like years. As it drew closer, Jacob could make out details that his mind almost refused to accept. Skin that glowed with an inner radiance, features that were beautiful and terrible in equal measure, eyes that held depths of intelligence and age that made human civilization seem like a brief spark in an eternal darkness. The being was tall, perhaps 7 feet, with proportions that suggested strength beyond measure, dressed in something that might have been clothing or might have been light itself, woven into patterns that hurt to look at directly. Jacob's knees buckled, and he found himself kneeling on his porch, not from conscious choice but from a primal instinct older than religion, older than language, the instinct to bow before something so far beyond human understanding that calling it an angel seemed almost insulting in its inadequacy. This was no cherub from a storybook, no gentle guardian with feathered wings. This was something that had inspired the ancient texts, the beings that made prophets fall on their faces and kings tremble in their palaces. The being stopped at the edge of the porch, and Jacob realized he was weeping, tears streaming down his weathered face without shame or self-consciousness. He felt exposed, every secret laid bare, every sin and doubt and moment of weakness visible to those ancient eyes, but he also felt something unexpected, acceptance, understanding, even a strange kind of love that was nothing like human affection, but was somehow more real, more fundamental than anything he'd experienced in church or in prayer. The being raised one hand, and Jacob flinched, expecting judgment, expecting fire. But instead he felt warmth spread through his chest, felt his heart slow from its panicked rhythm to something steady and calm. And then the communication began, not through sound but through something deeper. Thoughts and images and emotions flowing directly into his consciousness, like water filling an empty vessel. The being showed him things, vast networks of civilizations scattered across galaxies, councils of advanced beings who had watched humanity since before recorded history, agreements and treaties and hierarchies that governed the interaction between dimensions and species. And there, in the center of these cosmic webs, were beings like the one standing before him, Nordic-looking humanoids with light hair and ethereal features, beings that human mystics and contactees had encountered for decades, beings that many believed were the good aliens, the benevolent watchers, the angels in disguise. But then the vision shifted, and Jacob saw something that made his blood run cold. The being showed him another figure, materializing in the pasture behind him, and when Jacob's eyes focused on this new arrival, every instinct in his body screamed danger. The creature was reptilian, with scaled skin that shimmered green and gold in the starlight, vertical pupils in eyes that held a predatory intelligence, a muscular frame that moved with coiled power. It was the kind of being that populated nightmares and conspiracy theories, the kind of entity that people whispered about in online forums and late-night radio shows, the Reptilians, the supposed controllers, the dark forces that manipulated humanity from the shadows. Jacob's mind reeled, trying to reconcile this nightmare creature with the angelic being before him. But then something happened that shattered his entire understanding of good and evil, light and dark, angels and demons. The reptilian being, this creature of scales and predatory grace, dropped to one knee before the Nordic entity, its head bowed in a gesture of absolute submission, absolute obedience. The posture was unmistakable. This was not an equal, not a rival, but a servant acknowledging its master. The Nordic being's thoughts flooded Jacob's mind again, and this time the message was clear and devastating. You call us angels, and you call them demons, but these are your words, your categories, your need to divide creation into simple stories. We are the architects, the shepherds, the designers of the path you walk. They are our instruments, our tools for refinement and testing. The darkness you fear is not our enemy. It is our servant, cultivated and controlled, deployed with precision to strengthen, to challenge, to separate the wheat from the chaff. Your religions speak of spiritual warfare, of battles between light and shadow. But what if we told you that both armies answer to the same commanders? What if the struggle itself is the point, the crucible designed to forge souls into something worthy of what comes next? Jacob's mind rebelled against these words, against the implications that crashed through his worldview like a wrecking ball through a paper house. His faith had been built on the foundation of cosmic conflict, on the belief that God and Satan were locked in eternal struggle, that humans were caught in the crossfire, that choosing the light meant rejecting the darkness absolutely and completely. But here, kneeling in his pasture, was proof that the war might be theater, that the enemy might be a manufactured opponent, that the angels he'd prayed to his entire life might be something far more complex and morally ambiguous than any sermon had suggested. The reptilian being rose at some unspoken command and approached the porch, and every muscle in Jacob's body tensed for flight or fight, but the Nordic entity's presence held him in place, not through force, but through a kind of gravitational pull he couldn't resist. The reptilian stopped a few feet away, and Jacob could see intelligence in those vertical pupils, could sense a consciousness that was old and deep and utterly alien to human experience. And then it spoke, not with vocal cords but with the same mental communication the Nordic used, its voice like gravel sliding through his thoughts. We are the refiners, human. We are the pressure that creates diamonds, the fire that purifies gold. Your species would have remained stagnant, content with comfort if not for the challenges we introduce. Every temptation that strengthens you, every trial that forces you to choose love over fear, every moment of darkness that makes you reach for light, these are our gifts, administered under their direction. The creature gestured toward the Nordic being with one clawed hand. You think we are evil, but we are necessary. You think they are good, but they are pragmatic. The universe does not bend to your moral simplicities, Jacob Miller. It operates on principles far older than your prophets, far colder than your prayers. Jacob wanted to scream, wanted to reject these revelations, wanted to run into his house and bury himself under the covers like a child hiding from monsters. But something kept him rooted in place, something deeper than fear. Curiosity, the need to understand, the terrible hunger for truth, even when that truth burns going down. He found his voice again, shaky but determined. So, Jesus, the Bible, everything I believed, it's all a lie? The Nordic being's presence intensified, and Jacob felt something like disappointment mixed with patience, the way a teacher might regard a student who's asking the wrong question. The thoughts came again, gentler this time, almost tender. Not a lie, Jacob, a story, a framework, a teaching tool, calibrated for your species at your level of development. Every culture receives the truth in the form it can process. Your Jesus was real, his message was real, his love was real, but the mechanics beneath that story, the cosmic infrastructure that allows for incarnations and resurrections and salvation, these are more complex than your scriptures suggest. He was one of us sent to walk among you, to show you what your species could become if you embraced the highest frequencies of existence. But his mission was part of a larger program, one that includes what you call angels and what you call demons, because both are necessary for the evolution we're cultivating. The words settled over Jacob like snow, cold and suffocating and impossible to brush away. His mind grasped for anchors, for something solid in this sea of revelation that threatened to drown everything he'd built his life upon. The rapture, he whispered, remembering the sermons about Christ's return, about the faithful being taken up, about the tribulation and the final battle. Is that real? Are you coming back for us? The Nordic being tilted its head, and Jacob felt something like amusement ripple through the mental connection. though not cruel, more like the fondness one might feel watching a child's innocent question. The rapture, the second coming, the harvest, yes, these events are scheduled, but not in the way your preachers imagine. It is not about religion, Jacob. It is about frequency, about which souls have evolved to the point where they can survive the transition to what comes next. The earth is reaching the end of a cycle, a cosmic season changing, and those who have raised their consciousness to resonate with higher dimensions will be taken, yes, but not to clouds and harps. They will be integrated into the broader community of awakened beings, given new roles, new responsibilities, new realities to explore. Those who remain will continue their lessons under new conditions, more intense, more demanding, because the timeline is accelerating and decisions must be made. Jacob's head spun with the implications. So the saved and the damned, it's not about accepting Jesus or rejecting him. The Nordic's response came swift and clear. Your Jesus taught love, compassion, service, humility. These qualities raise frequency. Those who embody these teachings, regardless of the religious label they use, are preparing themselves for graduation. Those who choose fear, hatred, control, separation, they are anchoring themselves to lower frequencies and will recycle through harder lessons until they learn. Your Bible contains truth, but it is one book among many, one story among thousands we have planted across your world to guide you. The name you call the divine matters less than the frequency you embody. This is why your daughter struggles with your church, Jacob. She senses the limitations of the container, even while hungering for the content. She has not rejected truth. She has rejected the narrowness of its presentation. The mention of Sarah hit Jacob like a physical blow, and fresh tears spilled down his face. Can I tell her this? Can I explain what I've learned tonight? The Nordic being's presence softened, and Jacob felt something like compassion flow through the connection. You can try, but words will fail you. This experience exists beyond language, beyond proof, beyond the kind of evidence your species trusts. She will think you have had a breakdown, that grief has fractured your mind, that loneliness has made you susceptible to delusion. And perhaps she will be right to think these things, because from her perspective, from the consensus reality your culture agrees to call real, tonight did not happen. You are not awake, Jacob. You are having a dream, a vision, a moment of contact with something that operates outside your normal bandwidth of perception. When morning comes, you will question whether any of this was real, and you will find no physical evidence to confirm or deny. This is intentional. Free will must be preserved. Proof removes choice, and choice is the mechanism through which consciousness evolves. Jacob felt panic rising in his chest. So this is all for nothing? You show me these things, you break my understanding of reality, and then you leave me with nothing. How is that love? How is that guidance? The reptilian being spoke again, its mental voice like stone grinding against stone. It is not nothing, human. Tonight will change you in ways you cannot yet perceive. Seeds have been planted in your consciousness that will grow in unexpected directions. Your prayers will deepen. Your compassion will expand. Your certainty will evolve into something more valuable. Wisdom. You will look at your fellow humans with new eyes, seeing the struggle behind their choices, understanding that everyone is exactly where they need to be in their journey. You will hurt for them, yes, but you will also trust the process more deeply than your previous faith allowed. This is the real gift, not answers, but better questions, not certainty, but humble curiosity, not righteousness, but mercy. The Nordic being raised both hands, and the air around Jacob began to shimmer, reality itself becoming fluid and malleable. He felt himself rising, not physically, but consciously, as if his awareness was expanding beyond the boundaries of his skull, beyond the limits of his body, stretching out to encompass the ranch, the valley, the state, the continent, the planet. He could feel the collective consciousness of humanity, like a vast tapestry woven from billions of threads, each person a unique color and texture, all of them connected in ways they couldn't perceive. He felt the pain of the world, the wars, and the hunger and the grief. But he also felt the love, the billions of small kindnesses exchanged every day, the mothers holding children, the friends making each other laugh, the strangers helping strangers for no reason except that it felt right. And threading through it all, invisible but undeniable, were beings like the ones standing in his pasture, Watchers, guides, architects, shepherds of a cosmic experiment so vast and ancient that human history was merely a footnote in its unfolding. Some of these beings wore the faces humans called angels, some wore the faces humans called demons, but Jacob could see now that these were masks, roles played for the benefit of the audience, and behind them all was a vast intelligence that did not fit into categories of good or evil, but operated according to principles of growth, evolution, transformation. The vision released him, and Jacob collapsed onto the porch, gasping like a drowning man breaking the surface of water. His body felt heavy, dense, painfully limited after the expansiveness he'd just experienced. The Nordic being looked down at him with those ancient eyes, and Jacob felt a final communication. "You asked to see Jacob Miller. You performed your CE5 protocol, and you called out to the universe with genuine intention. We honor such requests when they come from souls ready to handle the answers. But understand this: knowledge brings responsibility. You now carry information that most of your species is not ready to process. Use it wisely. Let it inform your actions without trying to force it into words that will only distort its meaning. Be kind to those still living in simpler stories. Remember that their narratives are as necessary for their growth as this revelation is for yours. The day will come when all is disclosed, when the veils are lifted, and humanity as a whole must confront what you have glimpsed tonight. Until then, be a light in the darkness, not by preaching, but by embodying the love that your Jesus taught, the love that is the only universal constant across all dimensions and all realities." The reptilian being stepped forward one last time, and Jacob forced himself not to flinch. Its scaled face was impossible to read, but its mental voice carried what might have been respect. "You withstood the revelation, human. Many do not. Many fracture under the weight of understanding that their cosmic significance is both greater and lesser than they imagined. You will carry scars from tonight, psychological wounds that will ache when the world seems too small, too ignorant, too trapped in its own limitations. But these scars will also be your strength, reminders that reality is deeper than appearances, that the game is rigged, but not in the way your conspiracy theorists imagine. It is rigged toward eventual enlightenment, toward the evolution of consciousness itself. We play our part in that process, and so do they." The creature gestured toward the Nordic being. "We are all servants of something larger than ourselves, something you might call God or Source or the infinite intelligence. These names do not matter. What matters is the work, the endless, patient cultivation of souls toward their ultimate potential." And then, without ceremony or farewell, both beings began to dissolve, their forms becoming translucent, fading into the starlight they'd emerged from. The light in the pasture brightened for a moment, brilliant enough to cast sharp shadows across the ranch, and then it rose swiftly, silently, vanishing into the night sky until it was indistinguishable from the stars themselves. Jacob remained on his porch, his body trembling, his mind struggling to hold on to the details of what he'd experienced, even as they began to slip away like dreams at dawn. He looked at his hands, expecting them to be changed somehow, marked by the encounter, but they looked the same as always, calloused, weathered, ordinary. The crickets had resumed their song, the night birds called to each other in the darkness, and from the western pasture came the gentle sounds of cattle settling down for the night. Everything was normal, perfectly normal, as if the last hour, or 2 hours, or however long it had been, had never happened at all. Jacob stood on shaking legs and walked into his house, moving like a man in a trance. He poured himself a glass of water from the kitchen sink, drank it down, and stared at his reflection in the darkened window above the basin. He looked older somehow, his eyes carrying a weight they hadn't held before, a depth of experience that seemed impossible for a single night to create. He wanted to call someone, to share what had happened, to hear another human voice confirm that he was still sane, still connected to the world of people and problems and mundane concerns. But who would believe him? His daughter would think he'd finally lost his grip on reality, pushed over the edge by loneliness and grief. His pastor would call it demonic deception, a test of faith that he'd failed by entertaining such blasphemous ideas. His neighbors would smile politely and find excuses to keep their distance, marking him as the crazy old rancher who'd seen UFOs and started spouting New Age nonsense. So Jacob said nothing, did nothing, just stood in his kitchen staring at his reflection until the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. The days that followed were strange in their normalcy. Jacob went about his routines, feeding cattle, mending fences, driving into town for supplies, but everything felt different now, like he was acting in a play, performing the role of Jacob Miller the rancher, while his real self watched from somewhere distant and detached. He found himself paying attention to things he'd never noticed before, the way light fell through the leaves of trees, the complex social dynamics among his cattle herd, the kindness in the eyes of the checkout clerk at the grocery store who always asked how he was doing. He started seeing people differently, not as saved or unsaved, not as believers or heathen, but as souls at different stages of a journey so vast that any single human lifetime was barely a single step on an infinite path. When he went to church on Sunday, he listened to the sermon about standing firm against the devil's schemes, and instead of nodding in agreement, he felt a strange sadness, a sense that the pastor was teaching a simplified version of a truth too complex for words, a cosmic children's book when the universe itself was an infinite library. Sarah called him a week after the encounter, her voice tinny and distant through the phone line. They made small talk about her job, about the weather, about nothing that mattered, and Jacob felt the gulf between them more acutely than ever. He wanted to tell her what he'd seen, wanted to explain that her questions about faith weren't wrong, that the answers were just bigger and stranger than either of them had imagined, but he held back, remembering the Nordic being's warning that words would fail, that proof would not convince, that each soul had to walk its own path at its own pace. Instead, he just told her he loved her, that he was proud of her, that she didn't have to believe the same things he did for them to remain connected. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then Sarah's voice came back softer, confused. "Dad, are you okay? You sound different." Jacob smiled, tears pricking his eyes. "I'm fine, honey. Just figuring some things out. Getting older makes you think about what really matters." Another pause, and then, "I love you too, Dad. I'll try to visit for Thanksgiving." After they hung up, Jacob sat in his living room and wept, not from sadness but from a release of pressure he hadn't known he'd been carrying, a letting go of the need to fix her, save her, convince her, control her spiritual journey. She was exactly where she needed to be, learning exactly the lessons she needed to learn, and his job was not to interfere, but simply to love her without condition, without agenda, without the requirement that she conform to his understanding of truth. The nights became his favorite time, when he would sit on his porch under the stars and feel the vastness of creation pressing down on him in ways both terrifying and comforting. He wondered if the beings were still watching, if they monitored his thoughts, if they were pleased or disappointed with how he was integrating the experience. He tried the CE5 protocol again, sitting in his pasture with his eyes closed, sending out thoughts of gratitude and openness, but nothing happened. No lights descended, no presences made themselves known. The sky remained stubbornly ordinary, and after an hour of sitting in the cold, Jacob went back inside feeling foolish and abandoned. Maybe it had been a one-time gift, a glimpse behind the curtain that would have to sustain him for the rest of his life. Or maybe he was being tested again, taught that truth doesn't come on demand, that the universe operates on its own schedule and not according to human convenience or desire. Either way, Jacob found himself settling into a new relationship with mystery, learning to hold questions without needing answers, to embrace uncertainty without collapsing into cynicism or despair. 3 months after the encounter, Jacob had a dream that felt more real than waking life. He found himself standing in a vast hall, a structure that seemed to be made of crystallized light, walls and ceiling stretching away into impossible distances. The Nordic being stood before him, accompanied by dozens of others like it, tall and luminous and beautiful in ways that made his heart ache. And there, among them, moving with easy familiarity, were beings of every description. Some reptilian, some insectoid, some that looked almost human, some that defied any earthly category. They were not fighting, not divided into camps of light and dark, but working together, consulting, planning, their attention focused on holographic displays that showed Earth from orbit, showed cities and forests and oceans, showed individual humans going about their lives, unaware of the attention being paid to them. Jacob understood in that moment that this was a command center, a coordination hub for the vast project of human evolution, and that every being in this space, regardless of appearance, was united in purpose, if not always in method. The Nordic turned to Jacob and communicated one final message. Tell no one what you have seen, but let it change everything about how you see. The rapture, the revelation, the great awakening. These are not distant events, but processes already underway, frequencies already rising, systems already shifting. Your planet is in labor, giving birth to a new version of itself, and labor is painful and messy and frightening. Many will not survive the transition, not because they are being punished, but because they are not yet vibrationally compatible with what is emerging. Your task is simple. Raise your frequency through love, through service, through compassion. Be a tuning fork that helps others find their own resonance. This is the work of the elect, the chosen, the awakened, not to escape the world, but to help it transform. Jacob woke from the dream with tears streaming down his face and an unshakable certainty that what he'd experienced was not random neural firing, but another form of contact, another download of information from the beings who'd chosen to reveal themselves to him that October night. He got out of bed, walked to his bathroom and stared at himself in the mirror, seeing a man who'd been broken open and reassembled, seeing someone who could no longer claim ignorance of the cosmic complexity surrounding human existence. The face looking back at him was still his own, but the eyes held something they hadn't before, a kind of knowing, a willingness to live with contradictions, an acceptance that the story he'd been told his entire life was both true and incomplete, that Jesus was real and the aliens were real, and somehow these truths coexisted without cancelling each other out. He thought about all the people who would call him crazy, who would say he'd been deceived by demons or deluded by his own loneliness, and he found that he didn't care. He'd seen what he'd seen, known what he'd known, and no amount of skepticism from others could erase the experience from his consciousness. Over the following months, Jacob noticed changes in himself that he couldn't fully explain. He found himself drawn to books and videos he would have dismissed as heretical a year ago. Materials about consciousness, about quantum physics and spirituality, about ancient civilizations and their contact with non-human intelligence. He read about the Anunnaki, about the Pleiadians, about the councils of light and the various agendas supposedly competing for influence over humanity's future. Some of it resonated with what he'd been shown, some of it seemed like fantasy or disinformation, but all of it contributed to a larger picture of a universe teeming with life and intelligence, a cosmos where Earth was not the center, but merely one school among billions where souls came to learn and grow. He stopped attending his church, not from loss of faith but from outgrowing the container, and he found spiritual nourishment in solitude, in nature, in the quiet conversations he had with God or Source, or whatever name fit the infinite intelligence he felt surrounding him at all times. His neighbors noticed the change and worried about him, asked if he needed anything, if he was okay living alone on that big ranch, with nothing but cattle for company. Jacob assured them he was fine, better than fine actually, but he knew they couldn't understand without having walked through their own experience of contact and revelation. Sarah came to visit for Thanksgiving as promised, and Jacob was struck by how beautiful she looked, how confident and self-possessed, how much she'd grown into herself despite, or maybe because of, her questioning of the faith she'd been raised in. They cooked together, talked about her work, laughed at old stories, and somewhere in the middle of dinner, Sarah looked at him with those intelligent eyes she'd inherited from her mother and said, "Dad, something's different about you. You seem, I don't know, lighter somehow, less worried. Did something happen?" Jacob smiled and shook his head. "Nothing specific. Just getting older and realizing that I don't have to have everything figured out. I'm learning to trust the process more, worry about the outcome less." Sarah studied him for a long moment, and Jacob could see her trying to decide whether to press the issue or let it go. Finally she nodded and said, "Well, whatever it is, it looks good on you. You seem more at peace than I've seen you in years." They finished dinner in comfortable silence, and later that night, after Sarah had gone to bed in her old room, Jacob stood on the porch and looked up at the stars, sending out a silent thank you to whatever forces had orchestrated his awakening. Grateful not for answers, but for better questions, not for certainty, but for the humility to admit how little he truly understood. Winter came to Montana with its usual severity, burying the ranch in snow and forcing Jacob to spend long hours indoors. He used the time to write, filling notebooks with his experiences and reflections, not for publication but for his own processing, his own attempt to capture in words what existed beyond language. He wrote about the night of contact, about the Nordic being and the Reptilian, about the revelation that the hierarchy of light included what humans called darkness. He wrote about his changing understanding of Jesus, seeing him now not as the exclusive son of an angry God, but as one among many ascended masters who'd incarnated to help humanity evolve, a frequency anchor who demonstrated what humans could become if they embraced unconditional love as their primary operating system. He wrote about the rapture, understanding now that it might not be a single dramatic event, but an ongoing sorting process, souls naturally gravitating toward the realities and frequencies they'd prepared themselves for through countless choices and experiences. And he wrote about his own fear, his own resistance to letting go of the simpler story, the childlike faith that had sustained him through loss and loneliness, but that now felt too small to contain the truth he'd glimpsed. Spring arrived slowly, grudgingly, snow melting to reveal the brown grass underneath, and Jacob felt something stirring in himself as well, some new growth pushing up through the frozen ground of his conditioning. He started attending a meditation group in town, a small gathering of seekers and mystics who met in someone's living room to practice silence and share experiences. He told them nothing about his encounter, but he listened to their stories of synchronicity and awakening, of near-death experiences and past life memories, of communications with angels and spirit guides, and he recognized in their accounts echoes of his own journey. These were people who'd stepped outside the mainstream narrative, who dared to explore the margins of consciousness, and come back with reports of a reality far more complex and beautiful than the materialist worldview allowed. Jacob found community among them, found a place where he didn't have to pretend that the universe was smaller than he knew it to be, and in their acceptance, he found a kind of peace that had eluded him in the church pews of his youth. One evening in late April, as Jacob sat in his pasture watching the sunset, he felt a presence beside him. He didn't see anything, didn't hear anything, but he knew with absolute certainty that he was not alone, that the beings who'd contacted him that October night were back, or perhaps they'd never left. Perhaps they'd been watching all along, monitoring his integration of the experience, pleased with how he'd handled the knowledge they'd entrusted to him. He felt a gentle warmth in his chest, felt a communication that came not as words or images, but as pure knowing. "You have done well, Jacob Miller. You did not break under the weight of revelation. You did not become arrogant or messianic. You did not try to force your experience onto others or start a cult or claim special status. You simply allowed the truth to change you quietly, privately, transforming your frequency without announcing your transformation. This is the way of the true initiate, the genuine adept. The universe does not need more prophets shouting from street corners. It needs more silent servants raising the collective vibration through their mere presence, through the quality of their being rather than the volume of their proclamations. Continue on this path. Your daughter will awaken in her own time and her own way, and when she does, she will remember this time. Remember how you gave her space to doubt and question without withdrawing your love. This is the greatest teaching you could offer her, unconditional acceptance while embodying your own truth without apology. The days ahead will be turbulent for your species. Systems will collapse, certainties will crumble, people will cry out for answers and stability. Be a rock in that storm, not through preaching but through presence, not through knowing but through being. The presence faded, and Jacob was alone again with the sunset and the awakening spring, and the endless Montana sky stretching overhead like a promise. He stood slowly, his old bones creaking, and walked back to his house feeling grateful and humbled and strangely excited about whatever came next. He didn't know if he'd ever have another direct encounter. Didn't know if the beings would contact him again before the great transition they'd described, but it didn't matter. He'd been given a gift, a glimpse behind the curtain, and that gift had fundamentally altered his relationship with reality. He could never go back to the simple faith he'd held before, could never again pretend that the universe was as small and manageable as his childhood Sunday school lessons had suggested. But in losing that simple faith, he'd gained something more valuable. Direct experiential knowledge that consciousness was eternal, that love was the fundamental force underlying all creation, that death was not an ending, but a transition, and that the cosmic drama of good versus evil was far more nuanced and mysterious than any human religious system could capture. Jacob lived another 15 years after his encounter, dying peacefully in his sleep at the age of 88, his daughter at his bedside, his life complete, and his consciousness ready for whatever came next. In those 15 years, he never once spoke publicly about what he'd experienced that October night, never wrote a book or gave an interview, or tried to convince anyone of the truths he'd been shown. He simply lived differently, more openly, more compassionately, more connected to the vast web of consciousness that he knew surrounded and interpenetrated all of physical reality. When Sarah cleaned out his house after his death, she found his notebooks, found his meticulous accounts of the encounter and the reflections that had flowed from it, and she sat in his living room reading them with tears streaming down her face, understanding finally why her father had changed, why he'd become so much gentler and wiser in his final years, why he'd stopped trying to convert her and started simply loving her. She couldn't say whether she believed his account, couldn't decide if it had been real or symbolic or some combination of both, but she knew that whatever had happened to him had made him a better human being, had transformed him in ways that no amount of traditional religion had managed, and that was enough. She kept the notebooks, stored them in a box in her own attic, thinking that perhaps one day when the world had changed enough to receive such stories without ridicule or condemnation, she might share them, might add her father's voice to the growing chorus of people who'd encountered something beyond the boundaries of consensus reality and come back transformed. Truth or delusion, reality or elaborate self-deception, perhaps these are the wrong questions, binary choices that miss the essential point. What matters is not whether Jacob's experience can be verified by external evidence, but whether it served his evolution, whether it opened him to greater love and wisdom, whether it helped him become more fully human and more fully divine. The universe may indeed be stranger than we imagine, populated by hierarchies of beings playing out dramas of cosmic significance, with humans as unwitting participants in a game whose rules we barely comprehend. Or perhaps these experiences are internal, symbolic representations of psychological and spiritual processes, the mind's way of integrating profound truths that exist beyond language and logic. Either way or both ways, or in ways that transcend such dualistic thinking entirely, Jacob Miller's encounter changed him, elevated him, prepared him for a transition that all of us must eventually face. And if his story resonates with something in your own consciousness, if it stirs a recognition, or a remembrance, or a wondering about what might lie beyond the veil of ordinary perception, then perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the truth is not something to be proven, but something to be felt, lived, embodied in the quiet revolution of becoming more than you were. The stars continue their eternal dance, indifferent and attentive in equal measure. And somewhere among those distant lights, beings watch and wait and guide, according to agendas both benevolent and inscrutable. The good aliens and the bad aliens, the angels and the demons, the Nordics and the Reptilians, perhaps they are all facets of something larger, instruments in an orchestra playing a symphony too vast for human ears to fully comprehend. Or perhaps they are reflections of our own complexity, mirrors showing us that consciousness itself contains multitudes, that we are both light and shadow, both divine and animal, both creators and destroyers, and that our evolution requires integrating these polarities rather than choosing between them. Jacob Miller found his answer, or at least his peace with the questions, and in doing so he became a quiet testament to the possibility of transformation, a reminder that the universe is not finished with us yet, that new chapters are always being written, and that the greatest adventures often begin not with certainty, but with the courage to admit how little we truly know. The years that followed Jacob Miller's departure from this world were marked by changes that would have seemed impossible to the man he'd been before that October night. Changes that rippled outward from his silent transformation in ways neither he nor the beings who'd contacted him could have fully predicted. Sarah kept his notebooks hidden for 3 years, reading and rereading them in private moments, struggling with questions that had no easy answers. Had her father experienced something real, or had loneliness and grief finally fractured his mind in ways that manifested as elaborate spiritual fantasy? She found herself researching CE5 protocols, reading accounts from other contactees who described similar encounters with Nordic beings and reptilians, discovering an entire subculture of people who claimed direct experience with non-human intelligence and who spoke of cosmic hierarchies and coming transformations. The accounts were remarkably consistent across cultures and decades, describing tall, luminous beings who communicated telepathically, reptilian entities that served as enforcers or refiners, agreements between species that governed Earth's development, and an approaching event that would separate humanity into different timelines or frequencies based on consciousness level. Sarah couldn't decide if this consistency proved the reality of the phenomenon or simply demonstrated how humans share archetypal experiences when placed under psychological stress, how the mind produces similar symbols when grappling with transcendence and terror in equal measure. Truth or fiction? Maybe even the storyteller does not know. Here, stories exist to touch and make you reflect. The magic only reveals itself to those who allow themselves to feel, not to those who insist on seeking certainties.